The story begins on a humid morning in 1943, when a patrol team on a remote Pacific island spotted something unusual lying half-hidden beneath a line of palm trees. At first, the Americans thought it was another burnt-out Japanese wreck, the kind they had seen countless times during months of fighting. But as they approached, the aircraft's long, slender fuselage and distinctive tail fins told a different story. This one hadn't been destroyed. It hadn't even been touched. It was a Mitsubishi G4M, the bomber the Americans called the Betty. And somehow, against all odds, it was almost completely intact. The discovery sent a shock through the camp. An intact Japanese bomber was incredibly rare. Most were either blown apart in midair or burned to ash on impact. But this one looked as if it had simply landed. A few Marines moved cautiously toward it, rifles raised. There were no bodies nearby, no signs of a firefight, no bullet holes in the fuselage, only deep tire marks in the sand and a broken section of landing gear. Something had forced the crew down, and they had vanished into the jungle. Once the area was secured, a team of U.S. pilots and mechanics gathered around the aircraft, circling it like archaeologists studying an ancient relic. They had fought against these bombers for months, watching them streak across the sky in long-range attacks, but none of them had ever been close enough to touch one. Now they were running their hands over the metal skin, peering inside the cockpit, and examining the gun turrets in silence. The more they looked, the stranger the discovery felt. The bomber was fully armed. The radios were still inside. Even the navigation maps were scattered across the instrument panel. It was as if the crew had left in a hurry, or had planned to return but never did. Word spread quickly. Within hours, the aircraft was surrounded by officers, intelligence specialists, and pilots eager to understand their enemy's design. The Betty had a reputation. Fast, long-ranged, and terrifyingly easy to shoot down. But now the Americans had the chance to see why. A small group of test pilots arrived the next morning, walking around the bomber with quiet curiosity. They noted the thin fuselage, the lightweight structure, and the unusually large fuel tanks. One pilot tapped the skin of the aircraft with his knuckle and frowned. It sounded hollow, too hollow for a combat machine expected to survive heavy fire. The bomber was soon towed to a makeshift runway for transport and study. As it rolled across the sand, the American crews exchanged uneasy glances. They knew that capturing this aircraft wasn't just a stroke of luck. It was an opportunity. Understanding why the Japanese built a bomber so lightly, why it lacked protection, and why it relied so heavily on speed would reveal the weaknesses that U.S. pilots had sensed but never fully understood. For now, though, the island remained strangely quiet. The jungle swallowed the footprints of the missing crew. The ocean winds erased the landing marks, and the captured Betty bomber sat under the glaring Pacific sun, waiting to tell its secrets to the enemy who had finally caught it. When the captured Betty bomber was finally hauled into the repair bay, the American mechanics approached it with a strange mix of excitement and disbelief. They had fought the G4M for months, watching it blaze across the sky like a comet whenever a single tracer round touched its frame. Now, for the first time, they could walk inside the machine responsible for so much destruction, yet notorious for being destroyed so easily. The moment they opened the side hatch, hot air escaped from the interior as though the metal itself was still holding onto the memory of previous missions. The inside smelled of fuel, oil, and something faintly burnt, as if the aircraft had lived its life too close to fire. The structure shocked the Americans almost immediately. The internal framework was astonishingly thin, more like the ribbing inside a fishing boat than a frontline bomber. The metal plates felt fragile under their fingertips. A mechanic whispered, "This thing's practically made of tin." No one disagreed. As they moved deeper inside the fuselage, the truth of the G4M's design philosophy became painfully clear. Speed and range above all else. And everything else, armor, protection, survivability, had been sacrificed. One pilot stopped beside a large cylindrical shape housed directly under the wing root. He wiped away dust with his glove, then stepped back. "Is that?" The fuel tank? It was enormous, stretching across a significant portion of the interior. Another tank sat just opposite it, equally exposed. There was a long silence. The Americans looked around for armor plating, self-sealing rubber layers, or any kind of reinforcement that would normally protect such volatile components. Instead, they found nothing, just bare metal and thin sheets of aluminum. One mechanic ran his fingers across the tank and shook his head. One spark and the whole thing goes up. Another added, "No wonder they burn like torches." As they continued exploring the rear of the aircraft, the same pattern repeated. Minimalist frames, exposed cables, narrow walkways, and almost no reinforcement anywhere. Even the crew positions felt dangerously vulnerable. The tail gunner's station was a cramped bubble of glass and thin metal. The central walkway was so narrow that a man could barely pass without turning sideways. But it was the cockpit that truly stunned the Americans. Sitting in the pilot's seat, one officer realized he could almost reach every major control without leaning. It was simple, efficient, and terrifyingly unprotected. No armored backres. No protective glass. Just a thin sheet of metal between the pilot and the outside world. The instrument panel revealed another clue. Long-distance navigation tools dominated the layout, and the fuel gauge clusters were oversized. This bomber wasn't built to survive a fight, it was built to fly far. Very far. Japan needed range, one intelligence officer muttered. So they stripped everything else away. The most chilling discovery came when a mechanic tapped the inner wall beside the nose compartment and heard a hollow echo. That hollow space, he realized, sat directly beside a fuel tank. A bullet entering from almost any angle would puncture it. The Americans stepped outside into the sunlight, shaken and strangely sympathetic. The G4M wasn't a bomber meant to protect its crew. It was a bomber meant to reach its target, drop its payload, and rely on speed, not armor, to escape. Inside the captured Betty, the truth became impossible to ignore. The Japanese had engineered a masterpiece of range and a disaster of survivability. A flying torch, beautiful, lethal, and tragically vulnerable. When the captured G4M Betty bomber was finally patched together and declared airworthy, American pilots at the test field in the Pacific felt a strange mix of excitement and unease. They had studied enough wrecks to know the bomber's dark nickname, the Flying Lighter, but flying one themselves was an entirely different matter. Captain Robert Hayes, a seasoned test pilot, climbed into the cockpit for the first evaluation run. The interior struck him immediately. Thin aluminum ribs, panels that rattled under his fingers, and fuel line pipes running beneath the floor like exposed veins. There was no armor, no self-sealing rubber, no reinforcement. It felt less like stepping into a war machine and more like boarding a metal drum filled with gasoline. Hayes eased the bomber into the sky, the twin engines humming with surprising smoothness. The G4M handled lightly, almost gracefully, far more agile than its bulky Allied counterparts. The Japanese engineers had clearly prioritized speed and range above everything else. And as Hayes banked over the coastline, he realized how they achieved it. By stripping away every protective feature a bomber normally needed to survive. The second test flight was far more aggressive. This time, the flight crew simulated evasive maneuvers and potential combat stress. During steep turns, Hayes felt the entire fuselage flex. Panels buzzed, the wings trembled, and the long fuel tanks, which stretched deep into the wings, sloshed audibly, as if reminding them of their presence. On the third test, they intentionally stressed the fuel system. Mechanics had warned Hayes that even minor leaks could turn catastrophic. Mid-flight, he noticed the temperature gauge rising near the starboard engine. A combination of heat, pressure, and unprotected fuel lines created a terrifying realization. A single incendiary round, even a tracer, could ignite the entire bomber like paper dipped in kerosene. Ground crews later replicated the scenario using controlled tests. One tracer bullet fired through a removed Betty wing tank caused it to erupt in a flash fire so violent that even the observers flinched behind the blast shields. The conclusion was immediate and grimly obvious. Hayes wrote in his report, "This aircraft flies beautifully, but dies instantly." The U.S. pilots came to understand why Japanese crews often went down in flames, why so many Bettys vanished during long-range missions, and why the bomber had earned its deadly reputation. The test flights didn't just expose a weakness, they explained years of Japanese losses. The Betty bomber was fast, elegant, and cleverly engineered, but it was unforgiving. A single hit turned it from aircraft to inferno, and the men who flew it had always known that. The first time American test crews pushed the captured G4M Betty bomber into a steep banking turn, they felt it immediately. The aircraft didn't fly, it slithered through the air, as if every joint in its frame were trembling. But nothing prepared them for what happened next. At 8,000 feet, the crew chief, Sergeant Hall, smelled it. A faint metallic tang of aviation fuel drifting through the fuselage. It wasn't a leak, nothing was broken. It was simply the aircraft breathing. The fuel tanks, long, swollen bladders stretched inside the wings, had no armor, no protective lining, no self-sealing material. Every time the wings flexed, vapors seeped out. Hall muttered, half joking, half horrified, "One spark and we go up like a Christmas tree." The pilots didn't laugh. American engineers had already heard rumors from Pacific aircrews. They called the Betty a flying cigarette lighter. One hit, even a graze, and the bomber erupted into a fireball so violently that surviving crew members were almost unheard of. But now, sitting inside the plane itself, the Americans finally began to understand why. In wartime Japan, weight was everything. Range, speed, and fuel efficiency determined survival. The designers at Mitsubishi shaved off every kilogram they could. Armor? Too heavy. Self-sealing tanks? Much too heavy. Reinforced bulkheads? Unnecessary. The Betty had been built to fly long distances, outrun pursuers, and strike deep behind enemy lines. But once Allied fighters began dominating the skies, the aircraft's elegant design became a death sentence. To show the danger, engineers rigged a demonstration on an empty runway. They filled a spare Betty wing tank with fuel, sealed it, then pressed a single .50 caliber bullet through the metal skin. No explosive, no heat, just the clean puncture of a single round. For 5 seconds, nothing happened. Then the vapors ignited. The tank didn't just burn. It detonated, a violent flash of orange and white, erupting in a roar so loud that even the observers behind sandbags flinched. A shockwave rippled across the concrete. When the smoke cleared, twisted metal lay scattered like charred leaves. The test pilot who'd flown the captured bomber earlier whispered, "Imagine that in the air, with a full load." They didn't need to imagine. They'd already seen gun camera footage. Bettys taking a single burst from American fighters and exploding midair before the film reel even had time to steady. Fuel tanks placed directly in the wings, exposed lines running along the fuselage, and no insulation anywhere. Even the emergency procedures borderlined on tragic comedy. If a Betty bomber caught fire, the manual's advice was essentially, descend, pray, and hope the flames don't reach the tank. Almost none survived long enough to try. By the end of testing, the Americans wrote a simple summary in their evaluation files. Catastrophic fire risk, structural vulnerability, fuel system design fatally flawed, aircraft not survivable under modern combat conditions. They weren't exaggerating. In the Pacific sky, every engagement was a gamble for Betty crews. They flew knowing that even a single enemy round, stray, glancing, or lucky, could tear their aircraft open and unleash an instant inferno. And that was the cruel truth the Americans finally understood. The G4M didn't explode because of enemy skill or overwhelming firepower. It exploded because that was simply how it had been built. A flying torch lit the moment it entered combat. When the tests on the captured Betty bomber finally ended, the American analysts gathered in a cramped room at Wright Field, surrounded by stacks of photographs, blueprints, and flight notes. The room still smelled faintly of fuel, almost symbolic, considering what they were about to discuss. Major Collins, head of the evaluation team, opened the final report and tapped the cover. "This aircraft," he said, "just taught us more about Japanese air doctrine than any spy ever could." What the Americans had uncovered wasn't just a design flaw. It was an entire philosophy, a mindset that had shaped the Imperial Japanese Navy's aviation strategy. The Betty bomber was built for reach, not survival. For long-range strikes, not endurance. For offense, not protection. And the consequences of that philosophy were written across the skies of the Pacific. The U.S. officers watched captured footage, Betty squadrons making daring low-altitude torpedo runs at Midway, charging straight into walls of anti-aircraft fire. Dozens were hit, dozens exploded, but they kept coming. Courage the Americans respected, but courage tied to a fatally fragile aircraft. Collins put it bluntly, they're trading pilots for fuel range. This revelation forced the U.S. to rethink how it measured enemy strength. Until then, American strategists assumed Japanese losses were partly due to poor pilot training or coordination. Now they realized many of those losses were simply built into the machine itself. The plane was so vulnerable that even an average hit by a rookie American gunner could destroy it instantly. That understanding reshaped U.S. air operations. For one, fighter pilots were instructed to aim specifically for the wings of Japanese bombers. Not the engines, not the cockpit, the wings. That was where the tanks were, unsealed, exposed, waiting for a single incendiary round. The Air Force updated gunnery manuals accordingly. New training films circulated among pilots stationed from Guadalcanal to the Philippines. Commanders encouraged squadrons to engage Betty formations aggressively, knowing how quickly they could be taken out of the fight. During one briefing on Henderson Field, an instructor told fresh pilots, "You don't have to shoot them down, you just have to touch them." Another strategic shift emerged. The understanding that Japanese long-range capabilities came at tremendous cost. If their bombers were this vulnerable, then their offensive reach could be neutralized early in a campaign by eliminating experienced crews, something the U.S. excelled at once its radar and fighter patrol systems matured. The Americans also learned a lesson for themselves. Range is useless if the aircraft can't survive contact with the enemy. That insight echoed through U.S. design bureaus and would influence post-war bombers like the B-29 and later the B-52 aircraft built not just to fly far, but to come home. Back at Wright Field, the final line of the Betty report became famous among engineers. The enemy's weakness is not always found in what they lack, but in what they value too highly. Japan had valued range. The U.S. valued survival. And in the Pacific, survival won wars. By late 1944, Betty losses were catastrophic, and their impact on the war had dwindled to almost nothing. But for American strategists, the lessons remained, etched into manuals, reinforced in training, remembered every time a pilot pulled the trigger and watched a burning bomber fall into the sea. The Betty had changed U.S. air strategy not because it was strong, but because it showed more clearly than any other aircraft what happened when a nation built its doctrine on a fragile foundation. A single bomber, captured by chance, had rewritten how the U.S. fought in the sky.